Joining me today is Simpson, Chris Hewlett and Ian Prosser CBE from Kelvin Top-SET. Thank you very much for coming in to have a chat. When it comes to what Kelvin Top-SET even is, from a 30,000 feet view, how would you describe it?
Kelvin Top-SET is an incident investigation and problem-solving company. So we teach companies how to conduct their own incident investigations, and of course we go out in the field and run them ourselves.
Chris, when people encounter Kelvin Top-SET for the first time, why usually is that in your experience?
Usually because something's gone wrong. Something's happened that they didn't want to happen, and they need to find out why.
And Ian, what are in your experience, in your words, what's the benefit of using or working with Kelvin Top-SET?
It's consistent across the organisation if you use it on an organisational basis. It's also really quite straightforward, which enables you to do investigation in quite difficult circumstances sometimes.
Across the three of you, you've got more than half a century's worth of experience, and I'd really like to delve into what exactly we can all learn from that. Jamie, starting first of all with the thing that often I've heard from the likes of yourselves before is about how important consistency of approach is. Can you tell me more about why that matters?
Yes, well, they're messy things often, incidents. There's lots going on, lots of different problems and lots of different approaches. And as humans, we all take different approaches and we all jump to conclusions. And if you're a major organisation with 10, 20, maybe even 100,000 employees around the globe, it's very useful for them to be following the same process. Now, the people change and the culture changes, but the process remains the same and gives you that consistent approach. So it's a 6-step approach, it's straightforward, it's easy to follow, and that means you can use it in multiple languages and different cultures and have an easy way of rolling it out globally.
Chris, how challenging is it to establish consistency, even from the very outset when you've received the call?
Well, it can be hugely challenging. I mean, the first thing you're up against is that you've already got people there who have usually formed their own opinions and their views, many of whom will come to it with their own ways of doing things. They may or may not have been trained. You face a situation which you're not directly in control of. So the Topset process and the tools and techniques we use more or less irons that out. It gets people actually, doing the same things at the same time and understanding what they're trying to do.
And how do you establish that consistency of approach on a practical level?
Well, the first thing really is at the first possible opportunity, is to try to get the organisation, and if they've got some sort of team leader already appointed, to get them to understand the need to do that and get them on side. Very often, if they've asked for a Topset investigation, they do realise that there is something coming down the line at them, which they're going to need to follow, and we need to get that on the table pretty quickly. But the opening messages really are all around preparation and not jumping in, and it's the jumping in and just trying to do an investigation without any thought first. That's when the problems start.
And Ian, in your experience with those sorts of challenges, with whether it's bias, it's people who've already made their mind up, what does Kelvin Top-SET do to establish order in that sense?
Well, if you follow the process logically, you actually will get, with the terms of reference sorted out at the beginning and get the incident investigation on the right track, and then go through the process of actually identifying your incident statement, and then actually going through each step and making sure people plan. That's the most important thing. And then you can also set the time frame in which you're going to do this, because there's often pressures to get this done as fast as possible, but in some cases people take far too long. So getting that sort of time frame sorted out at the beginning so that everyone understands which step you're going to take is really important.
Is there such a thing as investigating too quickly?
There can be, but it's better to investigate smartly and quickly, because taking too long very often leaves people, particularly if people involved in the incident, will start to form their own opinions. They'll start to reimagine what happened. So the faster you get to, if you're going to interview people, the faster you get to them, the better, because they will be, they'll be closer in their mind of what happened. Otherwise, you can start to get a sort of blurred picture. But it's not saying that, if, you know, even if you can't get, I've been involved in investigations where you can't actually interview the witnesses. But you can still gain a lot if you plan properly and get the information in other ways.
And talking off that information, you've got to have both consistency, but you also have to have lines of engagement, boundaries, if as it were. For some people who will be seeing this logo for the first time, they may be thinking, why is the word set in this yellow bubble or blob? So, Jamie, why is that? How does that tie into what we've said here?
Well, yes. Well, Topset spells out technology, organisation, people, similar events, environment and time, which are areas that you would look into when you're running an investigation. And we have various tools that help with that. We have indicators that help you ask relevant questions and delve into those areas. The logo, the yellow part you ask about, that's actually representing what's known as the boundaries of an investigation. And Ian pointed that out earlier. There was an investigation he's done where he couldn't access any witnesses. That can happen. You can turn up in country and you might have different constraints, different things pulling you. It might be that the coroner's investigating or the police, and you don't have access to certain bits of evidence. So it's really every incident you deal with is going to change, and that logo's a sort of different shape because there's all these different constraints that impact every investigation, and it will vary. And as I said earlier, culture can change floor to floor in a building, let alone across an organisation or a country. So you have to deal with that. You have to be flexible when you get on the ground. But one thing does remain consistent throughout, and that's the Kelvin Top-SET process. So with all these different constraints, you stick to the process and you do the best you possibly can with everything that's available to you. That's all anybody can ask when you run an investigation.
And Chris, bearing all of that in mind, there's obviously a lot of parties involved in any incident, whether that's the coroner, it's police, it's shareholders. How do you keep all parties both in the loop, but even satisfied, if you can say that, when it comes to investigating an incident?
Sometimes it can be really difficult. I mean, the ones you mentioned there, some of them are definitely not under your control. So the public authorities who get involved, you have to work alongside them, and either you can find you can cooperate, and sometimes you find you can't. But knowing who your end client is, you know, who is it that's actually asked for this investigation and needs the learning from it, must be well established. It brings me to something I think that Ian mentioned a few moments ago, which is terms of reference. All these stakeholders should have been thought about, not just when the incident happened and prior to the investigation beginning, but actually this should be pre-planned. I mean, you need one of these on the shelf. It's not something you think up at 2 o'clock on a wet Sunday morning when you're just about to head off down to the factory. That should detail out who these people are and what the relationships are. In the best organisations, this is dealt with contractually, particularly where different companies work together, and that can be managed. But if it isn't, then somebody has to take primacy and set out what the ground rules are.
Ian, you've been name dropped by your colleagues a couple of times there. In your experience, when you've worked with organisations where something has gone wrong, is it more often than not they've fallen into this category of perhaps not having considered all stakeholders involved, or perhaps not even thought about how do they deal with an incident when it has gone wrong?
That was some of the cases when I first joined organisations. When I first got involved in the underground environment, it was quite haphazard. And I introduced Topset to that environment simply to get consistency so that people understood, you know, what the terms of reference were, what the boundaries were, so that we could actually, rather than somebody, you know, in some organisations I've been in, somebody at the top has made up their mind what's gone wrong quite early on. You know, they start blaming people, and so the idea is you must make sure that it's an openness occurs, so that you actually get the facts rather than opinions.
On that point, is it Kelvin Top-SET's role to apportion blame at the end of the day? No.
This is, you know, the people that are, this is what I have worked involved a lot because I was a regulator. So, and there you are looking to find who's at fault. But in an investigation like Kelvin Top-SET investigation, I've done it alongside the regulators But what we wanted to do was a lot faster, because get the results and get the understanding, get the recommendations done before the authorities actually get to the point where they know what happened or think they know what happened. And I remember one investigation where we did it alongside the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, and we actually did it many months before, we finished it many months before they did, but they used a lot of our material in their report. But so if you have a plan, you put a team together that's good, doesn't have to be huge, but it's got the right capabilities and the right leader, then you can get these done reasonably quickly.
We'll come back to rail shortly. I want to focus on the incident reporting and take it back to that level. It's one of the most common things that people are looking to do. It's how to write an incident report.
Yeah.
Jamie, what would you say are the key factors in doing that and doing it well?
Yes, well, often they throw everything in a report and you get these huge sort of confusing documents. So you've got to go back to what Chris was discussing, the terms of reference. Who's your audience? And most of the time, your audience want to learn, they want to improve, but they don't have a lot of time to spend and read a 200-300 page report. So you need to keep it succinct, you need to keep it straightforward, almost writing it like a mid-range newspaper report. Keep the language straightforward, avoid jargon. And really it's about bringing out learnings. The whole idea of investigations with Kelvin Top-SET is about organisational learning and improving. If people don't understand your report, they can't learn and they can't improve. So really think about who your audience is, write it for that audience, and keep it straightforward. There's always appendices. These days with cloud-based systems, you can give them live hyperlinks to bits of evidence if they want to delve deeper. But the idea of a good report is that it should spell out what's happened and give you good, succinct recommendations. We do it in the form of SMART actions, which are specific to the problem. They're measurable. We want to know that someone's accountable for that problem, and we want to know that they're realistic, that those recommendations are actually going to be done properly, and when are they going to be done by? What sort of time are they going to be done with?
You mentioned their jargon and keeping things simple. I know there will be some people watching perhaps squirming, thinking, I don't want to dumb it down, or I don't want to make it too simple. In your experience, is there such a thing as too simple?
There is, yes, but you can actually put a key in. I mean, if you've got technical language, remember, not everybody reading your report understands technical engineering terms or technical terms to do with anaesthetics if you're in the medical industry. So you need to spell it out for that audience. So I've never really heard anybody complaining that it's too simple. They can always ask for more information. You can always explain more. But a good key covering those key points if you do find yourself having to use industry-specific terms that maybe don't go wider.
You've mentioned a couple of different industries there. Ian, would you say that the way in which Kelvin Top-SET helps organisations to write reports, or perhaps contributes that data, changes or varies depending on the industry?
Not in my experience, really, because it's a standardised process, so that's what's really valuable about it. And there's also what makes it important to train as many people in your organisation as you can, which is one of the things I did in one of the organisations I worked in, because we drove it down the organisation so that you actually could do these investigations very quickly at local level, very quite minor incidents, or not even an incident at all, but a near miss or near hit, as they call them. So it's very important to actually have that consistency. That's really I think the winning card in this game.
Anything you would add to that when it comes to writing a good incident report, Chris?
Well, just to emphasise, I think the business of the technical background, I very often deal with that issue by including a section, just heading technical background to the case, and in that's where you dump all the difficult stuff about what drives what and what the power of the motor was and so on. If anybody wants to read it, great, that's good for them, but then leave it out of all the rest of it.
And on that note, saving people time, perhaps, as well. Time, we all know, is precious, and particularly when it comes to investigating an incident. So how do you deal with, let's say, Ian, first of all, how do you deal with time constraints when it comes to incident reporting and investigations?
Well, I think the thing is to understand as soon as possible through your planning process how long you think you need, and then resource it in the appropriate way. with the right technical resource if you need that, if you don't, so that you actually can be upfront with your customer, if you like, or the person you're going to report this to, so that actually they understand how long it's going to take. Because there will be different timescales. But it's just important to be upfront as soon as you can, thinking it through how you're going to do it, how long you think you need. But then what I have seen many times, or too many times, is it then drags on. Because people get sidetracked onto other things, it drags on, and that's very unhelpful. Because as soon as you can come to some conclusions and recommendations, the better.
On that note, is there a range in which you'd encourage people to aim for, or is it really every case is different?
Not at all. Every case is different, but really it's doing the incident justice. At Kelvin Top-SET, we get engaged for major events around the world. From experience, we're realistic. We won't generally go out in the field for less than 10 days to kick things off, and that's actually at a minimum. They can stretch out. We've had investigations that we've dealt with running up to 2 years because they've been major events. So there's no real right or wrong, but you do be aware that with all the best planning you can make, and that you can put in the forefront, you can open a can of worms and things can stretch out longer. And the key is good communication between you and the stakeholders involved on what the expectations were. And again, having that consistent process and them being aware of the process. Ian mentioned he trained a huge number of people through the process because they have an awareness of where it is. So you can actually show them where you are in the process and get more buy-in to the time required. But realistically, if you're dealing with major events, you need to really give it a sufficient amount of time.
Chris, in your experience, have organisations perhaps underestimated the amount of time an incident investigation is going to take?
Some are more realistic than others, to be quite honest. I mean, yes, a lot of organisations have a pretty starry-eyed view of the amount of time that it doesn't take to do an investigation. It's a matter of talking people around, but a lot of organisations who have experience of this and handle incident investigation well already know this. They can balance off things like dealing with the emergency as a separate issue from the investigation, getting out a report with the basic details of what's gone wrong without jumping to any conclusions or making any judgments, and leaving that to the full investigation. I mean, there are techniques which can be used.
Yes.
And that's all got to be agreed up front.
Anything you would add to that, Ian?
No, having an interim report is a very good idea, because it will actually clarify what facts are known, so that some of the speculation disappears. And there's been one where there was one issue just a couple of days ago, which was sort of explaining what they knew to date, and that helps sort of gets people to understand the sort of basic facts of what happened. And so doing that actually can then let the investigation proceed in a sort of proper manner.
Tying these issues together then, the writing of the report, but also time constraints, how important is it that whether it's the full report, it's the interim report, that it is fact-based rather than perhaps opinion? Because you've mentioned various people may have different views on what exactly happened, but that's just an opinion. Is that as valid as the facts of the matter?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Opinions, everybody's got opinions. And we talked about it earlier, having a diverse team, mixed backgrounds, but really you then got to gather good objective evidence, and what you're looking at is the links and relationships. It's systems thinking. You're going to uncover all manner of issues, and there'll be good things, there'll be bad things, there'll be all sorts of organisational issues, and you're looking for the links and relationships and then discussing them with a diverse team. So yes, opinion of course comes into it. You can't get rid of it. We're humans. But basing it on objective evidence is critical. And that's where the Topset process comes in, gathering good, solid, objective evidence to base that off.
Yeah, I think I qualify that a little bit by saying actually sometimes it can be quite difficult to achieve that. And rather than talk about opinions and facts, it's probably better to talk about degrees of certainty. There are a lot of things that we can establish pretty much with a case, and we can write those down, and we're all comfortable with those. There will be other areas where we're going, well, look, even with everything we've done, we haven't quite chased these particular issues down. There's a reasonable probability they were right, but we won't know. And then, of course, and this is part of the art of leading the whole thing, is knowing where to draw the line and saying, but actually we've done enough. This is actually not, we could chase these things down, but it's not going to improve the outcome of the whole thing. We now know enough to go to the end and say, look, have we got enough to make our recommendations for change? I think that's where I would be.
Yeah, because I've seen that happen where, people continue to chase things.
Yeah.
And for very minor value, spend a lot of time doing it. And that doesn't actually help either solve some of the longer term problems or get some of the solutions. And I've had that happen in legal cases, for example.
On that point, once the report is finished and it comes to implementing the findings or changing the way an organisation operates, Ian, when it comes to implementing a system in, for example, in rail organisations, what would your experience tell you about that?
Well, you've got to have a really strong system, and when I've seen it operate the best, is to make sure you've got all the facts about, particularly if you've got recommendations and actions that are going to be tracked, to make sure they are tracked, and make sure as high up the organisation as possible they are monitored. And in many rail organisations, it's done at the board level, because they know that you can have a really great report, got all the root causes, but not much actually happens very quickly afterwards, and that's pretty pointless. So it's really important to have a very structured approach to your recommendation handling. It's what we had to have for my last organisation for handling RAID recommendations, so that you actually monitor that, and we monitored that our board as well, so they knew where we were. So, and the large organisations do that well. And they do find a lot of problems. This is not an easy subject, and sometimes they are taking far too long to clear. But you also got to make sure they're actually embedded. Because some people sometimes put their hand up and say, oh, done. They haven't really done.
On that point, on the surface it may seem easier for an organisation of 50 to implement recommendations than an organisation of 100,000. So what would your advice be, Jamie first, on making recommendations last, on making them embed in the way an organisation runs?
Yeah, again, it's a tricky thing and a problem with lots of organisations, and you hit the nail on the head. It can vary, but again, having a consistent approach. So in Kelvin Top-SET we use SMART recommendations, which many people will be familiar with from the business world. And really, when you're writing your recommendation, you want to engage your team of stakeholders. So you might come up with a specific recommendation that is specific to one of the problems you've uncovered, but then you might want to engage a wider team. You want to know if you can measure that specific recommendation you've done. You want to know if it's actually possible to do. And sometimes you don't know that as an investigator. So if I'm wanting to put in a new engineering control, I might need to engage colleagues that actually know if that's going to affect productivity, if that's going to slow things down. So actually using a consistent approach like SMART actions, specific, measurable, accountable, realistic, and having a timescale really helps you keep on track.
Chris, from your perspective, how difficult or easy is it to make all this stick?
I sometimes feel if I had a quid for every time I went into an organisation and said, that investigation we did last year, have you actually done that stuff? And they go, well, and then out come all the excuses as to why it's not being done. One of the two things we need to remember here. Firstly, the investigation itself is not the be-all and end-all of it. The investigation contributes recommendations and SMART actions into the wider organisation. And there has to be a mechanism there, and the investigation team has recognised this, a mechanism for coordinating that against everything else that's going on. Because what you do as an investigator may not be the top priority for that organisation. So Ian talks about the board getting involved. Yes, there's usually a senior management team of some sort that will sit down and review everything that's going on from time to time, call it an incident review board or what have you, and the investigation must respect that, and it's feeding recommendations and SMART actions, which at the end of the day have to take their place alongside everything else. That's one thing. The second thing I need to mention is the relevance of the recommendations themselves. Too often I see recommendations which have just been plucked from thin air. You've done all this work, you've done the investigation, somebody goes, oh yeah, I think we should do this. Yeah, great. That's not going to get done, because the best justification you have for actually carrying out the recommendation is because it's addressing one of the causal factors of the incident that's just happened. And if you fix that, you stop that happening. So address these things, and people don't seem to be able to make that link. And one of the joys of the Topset process is you can actually trace back through from the recommendations you come up with at the end, back to your analysis, and then into the body of evidence that backs it up. So it's completely evidence-based.
As we bring the conversation to a close, I want to finish by talking about the human element. There's the four of us sitting here today, but of course with artificial intelligence, does that mean that the role that you all play, is that at risk of people saying, oh, you know what, there's a large language learning model that can do this report for me? Is that something that concerns you at all?
No, it doesn't concern really, in that we've seen technology, and humans have to interact with technology. I mean, with Topset, technology and organisation and people, they're intertwined. And really, AI, yes, it might assist with investigations, but at best it will be a team member. It will be part of the team. You might utilise the tools, but it's going to need humans and looking at the interactions. So that human element's always going to be critical. Humans are involved in everything we do, and they're still designing all these technologies. So they're intertwined.
Yeah, well, sorry if I could just butt in on that, Jamie. I mean, the other thing, we're talking about the human element here, and the implementation of recommendations. The biggest thing, and we forget it all the time, is the handback. You know, at the end of an investigation, it's not just a report. Yes, you write a report, that's fine, but you've interacted with the people on the shop floor, with the middle management, with the senior management, even maybe sometimes with the directors of an organisation. And you have to keep them briefed, and you have to keep them on side. And if you forget to do that, you know, at the end of the day, what have they got? They've got a report. And they read it and they put it aside. And you've got to engage the people, and if you don't do that, there's an issue.
Yeah, and that's where some things go wrong, because you get a very extensive report that's written, and really the senior management of the organisation's not bought into a lot of the recommendations. And they're, sometimes I've seen them not very practicable either, in terms of the actual solution. And so you really do need to engage with those that are actually going to have to do it. And that's what's really important. And that was some of the failures of some of the investigation branches in the country that tried to do this to start with. Didn't engage enough with the duty holders who are actually going to have to do it. And then they'll just say, well, you haven't done you haven't done our recommendations. They say, well, you didn't come and ask us to see if they were practicable. You know, so it's very important that you do get that engagement and sort of buy-in to it.
And on that point as well, when it comes to these incidents and technology, do you believe that in years to come, when AI has a bigger role in organisations, that there will be fewer incidents?
No. You've always got humans, and humans are fallible. And that's what you've got to accept at the start, that if you're interacting complex environments with technology, and with humans and with organisational systems and the environment, then of course you're going to have incidents, because humans are fallible, and intertwining all these can cause incidents to occur.
And some of the design of some of the technology solutions has led to incidents itself, because they haven't taken into account a number of the factors, either the human factors or some of the other factors. So, you know, you've got a software engineer who will design something in his head that actually doesn't really work when it gets out there in the real world, and they haven't engaged, say, with a trained driver or a sort of person who's doing the job. And so high technology solutions can lead to more, sometimes serious accidents.
And finally, Chris, if someone watching this, if they're beginning to hear alarm bells sounding in their head, they can see perhaps an incident coming down the tracks, and a lot of this is sounding like something they need to act on, what would your words of advice be to them in terms of bringing Kelvin Top-SET in and starting what it is that you do best?
Engage early. Engage early. Don't leave us to try and mop up the issues when the investigation has gone off half-cock. And there's a lot of stuff to be repeated. You only want to do it once, get it right first time. There is an established methodology within Topset which does work. Follow it.
We'll have to bring our conversation to a close. Fascinating as always. Ian Prosser CBE, Chris Hewlett and Jamie Simpson, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.